Fantastic. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Liverpool and to IPPR's Fringe event on democratic reform, what comes next. I'm delighted that you're all here. My name is Harry Coulter-Pinner. I'm Director of Research and Engagement here at IPPR. And democratic reform has been at the heart of what IPPR has been fighting for since its inception. And we are delighted that we are ramping up our work on this really important topic as we speak. And Parth, who's here with me, can tell you a bit more about it in a moment. We also have an amazing panel. We have Florence Eshalomi, MP, Shadow Minister for Democracy, Oliver Coppard, Mayor of South Yorkshire, and Jessie Jo Jacobs, Director of the Democracy Network. So in addition to Parth Patel, who is a Senior Research Fellow here. So we have an amazingly qualified panel for today's conversation. Florence, you have to dive off early, so I'm going to come to you first to open the panel. Democratic reform, what comes next after the Brown Review?
Good afternoon, everyone, and good to see so many people here. 3 weeks and counting into this new role, but I think that shows that this is an important area for us as a party. I think back to how and why I got involved in politics. It was because for me, growing up in a council estate in Brixton, I felt that there weren't people who looked and sounded like me, but I knew that they were making key decisions that had an impact on me and my community. But we didn't have a seat at the table. And if we're really honest, I think about the last 3.5 years since I've been elected, we've seen a situation where our democracy is under attack. We've seen a situation where there have been so many changes at the top, that instability, so many people are feeling that politics isn't for them. Democracy doesn't work because those at the top are not listening. And if we're also honest, I think there's a hint of politics being out of touch. But one of the best things that I like about my role is when I go out in the community and go out in the schools, and our young people are so engaged. Our young people are so in tune in terms of what's going on. But yet our young people are not enfranchised to take part in that political process. I've been a long-time advocate for votes at 16 before everyone thought it was sexy. And I'm proud that when I was a councillor in Lambeth, I set up the youth mayor election. And what I saw from that was a range of young people getting involved in terms of how their voice can be heard. Young people don't want things done to them, they want things done with them. And that's the same for a number of our communities up and down the country. And I think we need to look at how representation shapes what issues get debated. Issues around housing, mental health, youth services, crime, public transport. Instead, for me as an MP for the last 3.5 years, we've had legislation that wasn't even on the governing party's manifesto, but we found time, parliamentary debate, to discuss that. But key issues that are filling my inbox haven't hit the floor of the chamber in terms of legislation. And for us as an opposition party gearing up and looking at, if we form a next government, it's about how do we get more women involved in politics? How do we get more working class people involved in politics? How do we make sure that we are looking at a range of people from different forms of backgrounds? As Angela said earlier this afternoon, how do we get people from the council estate, similar to the council estate I grew up in Brixton, onto the parliamentary estate? And I think the current representation gap really damages policy and the policy makers. And people feel that they're so far removed from what's going on in Whitehall. And it's around making sure we get all walks of people involved. For me, one of the challenges when you're going out, which I'm sure some of us do with our day jobs, around speaking to people about politics and why it's so important to vote. And it pains me when I knock on doors and you hear older people, adults, and they say they've never voted. And the data shows that if you get young people involved from an early age, they will vote through their lifetime. You look at the fact that with the Scottish referendum, given enfranchising 16 and 17-year-olds, you saw turnout go high there. And it's about how we address that. We've seen the Elections Act introduce photo voter ID. But we should ask ourselves that why is it that a young 18-year-old with a student Oyster card, that isn't an acceptable form of voter ID if you go to vote. But yet, an elderly person with a freedom pass, the same thing. That's acceptable. Who is being locked out of our voting system? So my role as the Shadow Democracy Minister is looking at the introduction of the new voter ID. The Electoral Commission have released their initial findings, and surprise, surprise, the key groups, a number of civic groups, charities, said would be locked out were the ones that had problems voting in the May elections. Elderly people, young people, people from minority ethnic backgrounds. So we need to look at how we respond to some of those things. And I think for me, it's around how we enfranchise more people. It's so important. People who live and work in our communities, they need to be able to contribute into the decision-making process and the voting system. And that's one of the things that I'm keen to get stuck into, looking at those recommendations from the Brown Commission and how we make that a reality should a Labour government have the opportunity to serve. Thank you.
Florence, I think you have to go in about 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is, before we bring the panel in, just see if there are 1 or 2 questions from the audience for Florence specifically about Labour's positions on some of these questions before we go. The lady right at the back over here. Oh, sorry, I've confused our team because we haven't got the microphone ready. The lady at the back. Brief questions, please.
Political and citizenship education has in engaging more people. Do you think it should be compulsory or just more advocated for?
And one more, we'll take the gentleman just at the front here. Sorry, Holly, to ask you to go across the whole room. A gentleman just here, yeah.
I'm Alex Tate from Reform Political Advertising. We're campaigning for there to be rules for fact-based claims in electoral ads, like the Slow Down Keir Starmer video, the Brexit bus, but there are examples across the political spectrum. We've pivoted what we're campaigning for around Lord Putman's recommendation in the Digital Technology and Democracy Committee to get that implemented, which is one of the key recommendations. It's not really a question, it's just like, we'd love to meet up with you. Congratulations on your new role to talk about that, maybe with Lord Putman.
Great. Do you want to come in on...
No, take them in reverse order. That's really, really important. I think for me, it's about in this role getting out and speaking to key people on the ground who've been working on this for a long time, and sharing your frustration that in reality nothing's changed, and I think we're at a turning point where we do need to shine a light on that. You look at some of the changes in the online safety bill around misinformation, fake news. I think there could have been a lot that could have been tighter on that, but I think this is a key area that we do need to focus on because a lot more people are getting their news from social media. So it's so important that that information is fact-checked, it's accurate, and that misinformation can influence people. So it's really important that we get the right thing out in terms of what's being pumped out in people's feeds. And on your point in terms of political education, I think, a really, really key area that we do need to look at. I've just come from another panel this afternoon with a group of young students and Labour students. And one of the issues they raised is how do we get more young people? Do we need to look at citizenship? And my colleague, Bridget Phillipson, was on the panel with me. She said that's an area that the shadow education team are looking at. Because I think it is important. Yes, we have the traditional subjects in schools, but if we are not embedding into our young people why it is to be good, active citizens, I still remember going to the polling station with my mum and my sisters when we were young. It was always before EastEnders. Making sure we go out and vote. My mum drumming it into our head saying, when we are older, this is what you should do, being an active citizen. And, just teaching our young people about democracy, teaching them. It shouldn't just be in November during Democracy Parliament National Democracy Week. It should be all year round. So I think that's something that definitely the shadow education team and I will be looking at.
And just on that point, we put out a report very recently called Out of Kilter, which is mainly about the school system. But one of the things we focused on was political education. And a really shocking poll, just a couple of stats. Less than 20% of teachers say they're in schools that have received visits from a politician. Less than 25% say that they do anything on preparation for voting. Less than 50% say they have regular citizenship lessons. Less than 40% say they have regular extracurricular things, debating clubs, things like that. So there is still massive inequality. And by the way, private as you can imagine, private schools. Private educated, much higher on all of those things.
Yeah.
So there is a massive inequality that needs to be fixed here.
I think the schools in my constituency are probably fed up of seeing me. I make sure I go and visit. Just a joy to visit the schools, including my old school, where I studied, both primary and secondary school, sixth form colleges, and it's in reverse, getting them to come and visit Parliament. It's their Parliament. All schools have access to Parliament. It's about making sure our MPs, our councillors, getting them to visit the town hall. All those meetings are public meetings. People think you need a special pass to come in. It's about engaging them. Obviously, my constituency is right across the bridge, so it's easier for them to get to. But it is important that our elected representatives, from our councillors to our elected mayors to our MPs, and people on public boards are going out and doing that engagement. It starts with us.
Excellent. Parth, I'm going to come to you next, maybe to tell everyone a bit about the work that we've been doing at IPPR on this topic.
Sure, yeah, and thanks so much, Flo. There was so much in there that resonated with the work we do at IPPR, the inequalities in who gets to speak, why it's so much harder for young people to speak in our democracy, and the inequalities in who listens, and why certain types of people become MPs and certain types of people don't become MPs, and what that means for our democracy. I'll try and sort of zoom out a little bit, think about the Brown Commission, and talk a little bit about the work we're doing at IPPR, if that's okay. So, the Brown Commission has a lot in it, right? From an elected House of Lords to quite radical devolution proposals to writing social rights into our Constitution. These are big, heavy ideas. And they remind me a little bit of the constitutional reform that happened while Brown was in government in the New Labour years. They're quite chunky things that happened in that period. Devolved assemblies, creation of a Supreme Court, kicking out quite a lot of hereditary peers, Bank of England's separation. They're quite big ideas, right? Despite all of that, all of those things, valuable in their own rights, sure, that period of time was a time where there was a general sense of decline in our democracy. People lost trust in our democratic institutions. There was just a general sense of democratic decline. Why, despite those quite big constitutional reforms? That's a big question, I think. As sort of David Marquand described New Labour's constitutional reforms at the time as a revolution of sleepwalkers who didn't quite know where they were going or why. So that's the key question, I think, here for Labour, if they are going to form a government. Where are you going with your democratic reform and why? And so I'll give IPPR's take on where we think you should go. And we can maybe get into a conversation of what that looks like. I think the first thing to say is the context is completely different. The world today, the country today, looks completely different to what it looked like in 1997, right? For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, for the first time since the birth of democracy in this country, people no longer expect their children to be better off than them. Wages are falling for most people after flatlining for about 10 years. We're no longer sure if a doctor or a copper is going to be there when we need them. The planet's on fire and the continent's at war again, right? That's the age of insecurity. You're going to hear that again and again and again over the next few days, but that's broadly what people mean. That requires a completely different set of policy solutions. We've got to think about what that means. In the face of insecurity, people naturally want control. That's most obviously in their private lives, but also in their public lives. Over a political process, that's not responding to what they need or what they want, right? From that perspective, seen from that perspective, the emergence of populism in that period, that 10, 15-year period, makes a lot more sense. People want to take back control. I understand that, right? Populism, in some ways, it's not rejecting the idea of democracy. It's saying, I reject how democracy is working, right? I want a different kind of democracy. I want my people versus the elite, right? That's misleading, but it still talks about a democratic ideal of control. And I think we have to listen to that. The reason it's so sticky, the reason we have, just last week, politicians using very strong populist lines at the Tory party conference, the reason that exists is because there's a semblance of truth in it. Our democracy isn't equal, right? Not everyone does have an equal say in where public policy goes. Some people's voices are a lot louder than others. Again, maybe the voice of London is louder than the voice of Manchester, as last week's suggestions might go, but sort of jokes aside, there's much bigger problems here, right? There's systematic studies of countries like ours and other democracies where we see policy is a lot more responsive to people at the top end of the income and wealth distribution compared to people at the bottom. People who've been to university, people who haven't been to university. Older people compared to younger people. So we have to ask what's going on there. Why is it that policy is more responsive to certain people? And these people, are also far more likely to say they have a say in what government does. Like, people who haven't been to university are twice as likely to say they don't have any say in what government does compared to people who have been to university, right? That should really set off alarm bells. So we have to work out what it is we do about that. And that's broadly the kind of work we do here at IPPR. We think about inequalities and who gets to speak and what's driving that. And that's partly about voter reform and allowing more people to vote, whether that's voting age or automatic voter registration or voter ID laws. There's a lot in that box. It's partly about inequalities and who listens. Why is it there's been a decline in the number of MPs coming from working class jobs? Why do we have so many MPs who went to private schools in Oxbridge? Why do we have so few MPs that went to a state school in Brixton? And then there's partly about who's warping in our democracy. You know, the voice of people is twisted in some ways by a whole set of interest groups out there. Some of them help enhance sort of political equality, and some of them sort of shift that. That's a much more nebulous world, but it partly alludes to the question that we heard at the front out here. So those are the kind of questions that we're thinking about at IPPR. I'm going to just round up by concluding what's next, right? And I think the next wave of democratic reform has to be clear-sighted. It has to be organized around one very clear principle, and that, in our view, is the principle of political equality. That if democracy is a collective problem-solving endeavor, each member of that collective should have equal influence over that decision-making process. It's a really simple idea. All constitutional reform should be pinned around that. If people are going to be authors of their own lives again, if they're going to feel a sense of security, they need to sense they have influence in the collective decision-making process. That means we need to think not just about redirecting our democratic machine. We might well need redirecting of a democratic machine by changing who's the operator, but we need to rewire our democratic machine. And as we think about the new politics of security, which we will over the next few days, we need to remember that economic and political reform must march together.
Thank you both. Oliver, I'm going to come to you next for some opening remarks.
Thank you. I wanted to ask this question whilst Florence was still in the room, but I think I'm missing my opportunity. So let me quickly ask this question, if you don't mind. How many people in the room, just by a show of hands, would advocate or support the idea of young people, potentially, I don't know, let's say for argument's sake, in the first 10 years of their life, being asked to compulsorily vote? By a show of hands. No, sorry, no, at the age of 18, but for the first 10 years of their voting life, potentially being asked. Sorry, should have phrased that more. That would be a radical policy idea, wouldn't it? No, from 18 to say, let's say for argument's sake, 28. Okay, maybe half. Thank you. I just wanted to ask that question whilst you were still in the room. Thank you very much. I think the reason I asked that question is because, look, that's an idea I've been talking about recently, not because we're going to try and advocate for that in South Yorkshire, just because I think it's an interesting question. But what I think I find in these debates in particular around democratic reform is there are no easy answers. There are a huge number of challenges when it comes to trying to change the way in which our democracy works, as I'm sure our colleagues from the IPPR would know very well, because it is big and it is contentious and it is difficult to get through any sort of system which, for reasons I think we all understand, has a natural bias towards keeping the status quo in place. So this is not an easy thing to do. It's not easy because of public apathy. And I was interested the other day when I was doing some stuff with the other mayors, and there was quite a few comments on some of my social media, essentially to the pointing to the fact that we've got this new sort of group of political leaders in this country, essentially an experiment in democracy, but lots of people don't really know what it is that we do. Even people who work within politics don't always seem to know what it is that mayors do. And so there is a sense of public apathy about trials, attempts, experiments in democracy. And I think we've got to kind of acknowledge that and understand that actually unless and until we win the argument publicly, we're never going to be able to get the consent to do this systematically. I also think all too often we talk about things like voting reform and reform to things like how we engage communities, how we involve communities in the democratic process. We forget actually that sometimes we have to look inward. And so, for instance, from my perspective, it's all very well and good having mayors and changing the way in which local people are represented, and essentially, I would argue, taking back control. But until and unless, for instance, Whitehall accepts that mayors have an absolutely vital role to play in solving some of the big problems that we face as a country, potentially through, for instance, absolutely transforming how we develop and build our economies, transport connectivity, skills, we're never going to win this either, because ultimately Whitehall are often, I find, a block on the transformation that we want to make, and we're already here. So it is a big and difficult thing to do, and it is systemic. Secondly, and potentially arguing against my own point, I would also say, look, we often come, I think, from a sort of deficit perspective when we have this conversation. We talk about this as though actually we've been static in terms of the way our democracy works, and I wouldn't say that that is actually true. I sit here as a mayor. My job didn't exist 10 years ago in South Yorkshire, at least. And so there have been big transformations to the way in which our democracy works over the years, and I think we should acknowledge that and we should build on it, because actually by showing people that we've made positive steps in the right direction, I think it's one of the ways in which we win consent for the next steps in this journey as well. We've done some things within the Labour Party, for instance, things like all-women shortlists, which I think were a good step forward too, whilst they were still in place. So there have been steps in the right direction. We have done things differently, and we have tried and tested ideas. In South Yorkshire, I'd like to think we're trying to do things differently too. I've said from the outset I want to be the most transparent and accountable mayor in the country. Now, if you look at Tees Valley, that's maybe not such a hard challenge, but I do think that we have to consider that question as to what that means, and in South Yorkshire we are. So in terms of the accountability, the scrutiny, and the way in which I engage, we've got a citizens' assembly that we are about to launch in South Yorkshire. The letters have already gone out to 30,000 households in order to go through a sortition process and get to 100 members of our community who will represent South Yorkshire and talk to us over the course of a number of weeks about what it is they want from the transition to net zero. Now, those sorts of ideas, citizens' assemblies, are increasingly popular and increasingly part of the political furniture, and I think we should build on that success because it's incredibly important. And I'm interested in where we can go next with that, be it through a citizens' jury or some other form of democratic engagement, because I think we have those solutions at our fingertips and we should build on them wherever we can. And then thirdly, I think sometimes when we have this conversation, we forget or we don't talk enough about actually, for most people, this debate, this conversation is not just in the abstract, it is a distraction from the real problems that they face in their day-to-day lives. What is the biggest problem facing people today, a mile away from where we're sat right here? It is not how does our democratic system work, and we can argue about whether or not that comes first, but actually people wake up in the morning not know if they're going to be able to feed their kids dinner that evening, right? Or if their kids are going to be able to go to bed in a house that is properly heated. That is the thing that is concerning them most of all, the cost of living. I was interested that the Prime Minister didn't mention it once in his speech, and yet it is the overriding problem for all too many people, not just in places like Merseyside or South Yorkshire, but right across our country. So we have to acknowledge that fact before we can get the consent and the legitimacy to engage in a conversation, I think, about how we change our system of governance and our democratic processes. Because unless and until we can draw a direct correlation between those two things, how we will improve people's lives and how we change the system, I think most people will just see us dancing on the head of a pin. I don't think most people care, and quite rightly, because our job is to make their lives better. And we have to show how, through this process, we can make people's lives better. And that has to be very real to most people before we get their consent to actually engage in that conversation. So it's important to me, it's important to you, unless and until it is important to somebody walking on the street 500 yards from where we're sat right now, I don't think we win this argument. So that's how we get there, I would think.
Thank you. And just to... And just to reiterate that, we did some work recently looking at different frames for how you win the democratic argument. And we went into that, or at least I went into that, thinking that potentially a kind of essentially left populist frame of, you know, there are the interests of the few are being served more than the many in our democracy, thinking that would land quite well. In fact, it didn't land that well. What landed really well was a delivery frame, like getting democracy to deliver the things that matter for most people. And I think that sometimes doesn't feel that comfortable to progressives. We want to make the moral case for a different democracy, but actually, if we want to win the arguments for the reforms that we know are needed, we're going to have to tell the story differently.
Can I just quickly come back on that, because I think it is pertinent, which is around our Citizens' Assembly and how we've messaged around the Citizens' Assembly, because look, citizens' assemblies are not cheap. I was surprised, actually, how much they are. Frankly, it's expensive, it turns out, to do proper citizen engagement, not unreasonably. The way that we've messaged that is about the people that otherwise might be ignored not being ignored. And I think in a place like South Yorkshire, where there is I mean, I'm sure like lots of places, there is quite a divide between those people who are, frankly, quite anti-net zero measures and those people who desperately want net zero to drive everything. It's really important to show a lot of those people that they're going to be heard through this process. And this is a process to allow people's voices to be heard properly in the kind of so-called corridors of power. So I think you're absolutely right, and that's the way that we've gone with our Citizens' Assembly.
Jessie, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I was delighted that this fringe was happening. And I think it's interesting, there were so many events at this conference around democracy in different ways, and we're trying to sort of map them as the Democracy Network. So we represent, we have about 300 plus members, organisations and individuals who are working on issues of democracy, whether that's representation, power, voice, everything from electoral reform, House of Lords reform, all the way to community power. And there's a plethora of activities that are happening, and I think that there's a reason for that, is that because people recognise that democracy, and I heard this phrase just this week, and I was like, I'm definitely going to coin that, it's a first order issue. Now, if you think about how we transform our society and we transform the UK, and we think about every single issue that we face, from the environment and climate to cost of living, to where economic justice and who has money and who doesn't. A new government presents an opportunity for a new governance, a new way that you run things. And I did an MA in business back in Durham a long, long time ago. I was really interested in business culture. And the reason why I was really interested in business culture and how things run is because that's how you create the sustainability of whatever you're delivering and building. It's the culture. So when should Labour get into power, they've got an opportunity to shift the culture of how things are done. And if they don't shift the culture of how democracy is done, how decisions are made, then actually the problems they're trying to fix are not necessarily going to be sustainable. But if you can change the governance, if you can open up decision-making in a way that people expect to be included in the decisions that are about whether that's their estate, their community, their town centre, the way we tackle climate, if there's an expectation that we're involved, then the ability of those who currently have the most power to influence what this nation looks like, what our communities look like, what our regions look like, diminishes, and it can't be taken back. When Ollie and I first met, we worked on Britain Stronger in Europe.
Don't tell people that.
Okay.
That's a huge success, it says that.
Well, I'm sharing that. It wasn't. But one of the things that took us both into communities was that we saw that a desperation of communities across Yorkshire, across the North East, to basically take back control. Places we thought would be for staying in Europe because of the economic things that it was bringing to those places, because of the benefits. They were absolutely adamant before we'd even started that they were taking back control and they were leaving the EU. A narrative had taken hold, and they weren't and it wasn't about taking control back from Europe. It was taking back control of every decision that'd been made around them and for them and to them over the last 20 to 30 years. The failing high streets, the failing public transport, the failing housing infrastructure. They wanted to take back control and have a say. And this was a narrative that played. And there was when we were looking at the briefing for this, there was one of the questions was about basically, could this be a dividing line for political parties? Well, we saw it with the EU referendum. We saw it with the Trump playbook, with the Drain the Swamp. They used a part of the failure of politics and money in politics, and bizarrely took hold of that narrative. And they are suddenly the party that's going to clean up politics, which, you know, if you follow American politics, seemed ludicrous, but it took hold. And actually, even just this week, we've seen Rishi Sunak talk about cleaning up politics. And that's if Labour Liberal Democrats, other parties don't get on the front foot with this, if they don't start to speak about it, then you risk other parties who don't have the ideas that are in this room, who don't have the real commitment to change. Because if they did, then why would you introduce voter ID, and why would you see anti-protest laws, and why would you see a rolling back actually on democracy? So yes, it should be a dividing line, but obviously there are other big issues. But if we can start to think of democracy as the paradigm shift, as the basis, as the foundation for everything else that needs to happen, and we can find a way to speak to the public and say, you want better buses, you want better communities, you want more play parks. They're your spaces, so you can take back control. You can have power over these things, and you have that by a stronger democracy. And we've got a number of brilliant ideas and innovations, and like Ollie said, we're not starting from scratch. It's not like some of these things aren't being pioneered. It's not like we don't have citizens' assemblies. It's not like we haven't seen other nations have standing citizens' assemblies, like Ireland and in Germany, where they're actually deciding on policy to be debated and decided. It's not like we don't have a big movement for electoral reform and a new voting system that is being used in other nations all across the world. It's not like we don't have an open governance system where you can actually have much more scrutiny in public contracts and what information the public can see. It's not like we don't even have the technology to enable people to have access to the information so they can know exactly who's funding their MP and know exactly what they're voting on and what they're speaking about. It is all there, but it needs political will. And so our job as all of the organisations in the Democracy Network and the wider kind of civic society space is to try and shift the Labour Party to get that political will, to say this isn't an and/or. It might seem technical, it might seem, you know, a bit like academic, some of the things we talk about, and I've definitely been to some of those meetings in the House of Lords where we talk about the minutiae of what policy group will do and kind of how the MPs can have more power by having extra committees and more scrutiny to the committees, and that's not going to wash with the public. But if we say we're going to ensure that people have more power and more say over the decisions that affect their lives, and that means a better standard of life, then I think we can start to push through. And that's what we all need to do, and I definitely highly recommend reading the IPPR report on that.
Thanks, Jessie. Right, I'm going to bring the audience in now. Sorry, Holly, I'm doing this early as well. And I'm going to try to make sure that we pick some questions from people who are... We're going to try and live out a better, more equal democracy by making sure we pick questions from every different group in society in the room. So if you put your hand up with a question, questions rather than comments, ideally, who would like to go first? Well, I've got the lady just here.
Thank you. I was very heartened to hear you advocating citizens' assemblies and that you are starting one off. There is a proposal in the Brown report which is about standards in public life and there being a citizens' kind of jury system around that, a standing committee to look at it. Is the IPPR behind that? I don't hear it being talked about in the manifesto.
Great. Gentleman in the front.
Thank you. Sort of similar to what this lady here was saying, it sort of touched on the Brown report. A lot of the Brown report suggests that meat should be added to the bone by the Labour Party and they should go out to consultation, it should be, you know, political actors and so forth that should be involved in it. But apart from, there's a lot, you know, Jesse, you talked about there being a lot of democracy events, but I don't see it happening in the main stage. Is it happening? Is it, you know, I worry that it's slipping away from us, and in that kind of sense of what you were saying around another party could just take hold of this. We're seeing it from the Tories. You know, are we marching forward this agenda? Because I can't see it in the manifesto either. I can't see it in the MPF document. Is it happening?
Great, and one more question in this round. The lady in red just over here.
Just with the introduction of like having more citizens groups and things in order to increase people's voice in their community, do you know any ideas of bringing education of understanding how that works? Because I know a lot of, especially young people, are turned off from politics because they feel it's too complicated to understand, and adding another layer to that could make that worse.
Great. So we've got a question about the jury's proposal for MPs. We've got a question about, remind me, democracy. Yeah, the degree to which it's being foregrounded by the Labour Party, and a question about engaging young people. Who wants to go first?
Sure. So just on the point about standards in public life and citizens' jury, so I don't know the answer to the question directly, but for argument's sake, when I ran for Parliament in 2015, I ran against a guy called Nick Clegg, who you may remember. Not necessarily the highest standards when it came to honesty and integrity, or at least that was my argument in the campaign. And one of the things that I said at the time was I was going to put in place, in Sheffield Hallam specifically, the right of recall for constituents, because genuinely it felt to me as though the big issue in that election was trust. And it was about whether or not people could trust their MP to do what they said they were going to do when they went into Parliament. So look, I'm always interested in those ideas about how we can demonstrate to our communities that we are doing things for the right reasons. I'm a big believer that when we communicate policy and when we communicate our jobs, the why has to come first. Like, why are we doing what we're doing? Not just what are we doing or how are we doing it, but why. And I think if we can get our communities to understand that we're doing this for the right reasons and that essentially we are in service to our public, then I think that kind of the good faith of our communities follows. Is it happening? I think so. So it might not be the kind of thing that Keir is going to talk about in his speech, and I don't know that for sure, but I would argue that quite rightly, as I said in my opening remarks, the Labour Party is focused on the things that most matter to people at the front of their minds, not the things that are at the front of ours. And I think that should always be the case, quite honestly. So cost of living, the economy, nothing working in this country. Now, you and I and everybody in this room might think that the way in which we get to better services and better decision-making is through a process of political reform. But I would be amazed if Keir were to stand up and talk about that at length, because the thing that people need to hear from him is going to make their lives better immediately. So I wouldn't take that kind of lack of clarity at conference as a bad sign, because certainly I'm somebody that is looking to the Brown Review to be a mechanism for mayors to use, and I'm optimistic about that. And then last but not least, I don't, look, if I can sort of question the question, I suppose, I'm not entirely sure that young people don't get involved in politics because it's too complicated. Because all too often, I think, it might be because we complicate it too much, if you see what I mean. So actually, politics for young people can be relatively straightforward. Do you want this or do you want that? And, you know, it's the job of people like me, absolutely, and politicians more broadly, to make politics more straightforward for different groups, not just young people, incidentally. All sorts of different people don't necessarily want to understand the mechanisms of the mayoral combined authority and how a mayoral combined authority makes a decision through an outline business case and a full business case, etc. They don't need to know that stuff necessarily. It's about understanding what the values of our communities are, what the priorities of our communities are, and responding to those. And young people are just as capable of telling us their priorities as anybody else. And I think it's more about, can people like me find mechanisms to hear those voices? And that's about engagement, as I think Florence was rightly saying, about going into schools and having those conversations directly and face-to-face.
Jessie, did you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think I'll come in on the question about young people. I used to run a Women and Young People's charity, and I've shared this story a few times. But we ran drop-in centres, we had residential sort of day programmes, we went into schools, did drugs prevention. One of the programmes that we did that sticks in my mind still to now was we basically had a group of young people who'd been really causing problems in their local community, and there was a lot of infighting, there was a lot of communities that weren't getting on with each other. And instead of doing things to them, which is what a lot of youth programs did at the time, we said, we want to work with you, we're going to give you pizza every week, and we're going to give you £10,000 to fix the problems in your community. And they were like, you're going to give us, like, they knew that they were the ones who were like, you know, playing knock a door run and throwing eggs at windows, and they were like, yes, we're going to give you the money. And they came every single week. This would young people who disengaged from education. Every single week they came, and it wasn't just because of the good pizzas. It's because we'd given them an ability to take some kind of control and agency. They ended up putting on a youth and a community event that had 400 people attend, the biggest attended event that had ever happened in that community. The communities that never got on, because there was a really mixed communities. There was a lot of refugee and asylum seekers and people with like mental health issues and alcoholism, and they came together, and it was so successful. But the next week they said, what are we going to do next? And they said, because we think we want to tackle the fact that we haven't had our windows replaced by the council and everyone else has. And there's loads of environmental issues, there's litter on the floor. They started to think politically. And all we did, so we didn't describe the political process and say, this is participatory budgeting, guys. We basically just said, here's some money, what do you want to do with it? And so, you know, when we think about shifting the culture, we think about education and how it runs, and if we're running schools or if we're on a parent governors, like, can we be asking the question, how do we give more young people an opportunity to have a say in how the school works? You know, what about our citizens' assembly and a kind of sortition process we often in the youth citizen space, they talk about people who sit on school councils are usually the usual suspects. What if those young people were chosen by sortition and you got the opportunity to represent your class or your age group that year? And what would happen then? Because what you're starting to do is practice what the change looks like. You're not having to convince them of the terminology or the academic language for it. You're just doing it. So I think there's something about the practice of it. And I think, yeah, and just to sort of go back on what Ollie said, like, that Keir Starmer has to win this election. To do anything, he has to win. And so the things that are political salience are the things that you'll hear the headlines. But there's going to be a whole group of political advisors and a whole group of Whitehall who are like looking for the answers. And so therefore our job in this sector is to make sure that we have the policies, the ideas and the links to those advisors who are going to be leading on the democratic change to go, you want to do it? There you go. Here it is. Here's the IPR report. Here's the Open Britain report. Here's the Democracy Network. We've done the work. We've done the thinking for you. We've got the evidence. It's there and ready to go. So I would say don't worry too much. But obviously, if we don't see any change within the next few years, then we might have to change tack, because this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and we want to make sure that it is really taken.
Yeah, I'll say brief comments just because we can carry on with questions. I essentially agree with what Oliver and Jesse have said on that last question about educating young people, so I won't comment any more on that. The one I disagree with them on is this question at the front about, is the Labour Party doing enough on democratic reform? And to be honest, I don't think they are, actually. I don't think it is being treated with the weight of constitutional reform and its power in the sort of arsenal of reform, which is what the party keeps talking about, reform. Constitutional reform is probably the most powerful weapon in that, and they're not talking about it enough. What they are talking about is this overhauling this economic paradigm of the past few decades, right? A new kind of economics, different kind of internationalism, a sharper focus on distribution, and greater state direction, public investment, right? Quite a lot of money potentially going into this. And I think what's missing is that, yeah, absolutely, we need to reinvent our political economy. I think most people in this room will agree with that. I certainly agree with that. IPPR certainly agrees with that. But to reinvent our political economy, you have to step outside the domain of economics. I don't think they've quite got that. The one area they do, I think, have grasped that is devolution, right? Place-based growth in this country for Rachel Reeves and for Keir Starmer is about devolution, devolving economic powers. I completely agree with that. But there is much more you can do within the bucket of political reform to deliver your new politics of security. And I think the job of people on this panel and people in this room is to try and mainstream that, to make them see, actually, these are policy levers you can use to get broad-based growth, to rebuild trust in your institutions, to mute the populist challenge. These are all things we want to see happen. You should think about political reforms a bit more. So I think there's a task there to be done, whether it's mission number 1 about fastest growth in the G7 or whether it's mission number 5 about levelling up opportunity in this country. Constitutional reform is part of the answer there. And I think there's definitely a lot more work to be done. I wouldn't sit back over the next year and say, oh, well, maybe they'll win the election and they'll realise that. I think there's still a convincing job to be done. Very quickly on the standards in public life and citizens' jury. So Angela Rayner made a speech a few months ago committing to some kind of institutional reform about standards in life, a different kind of commissioner and a different approach. It was notable it didn't involve the citizen jury. It decided not to go down that approach. Whether that's right or wrong, I think, is up for debate. I think it's welcome to see a much sharper focus on the integrity of MPs. I think that is clearly necessary in our constitution. It's a gap there. And I, for one, and IPPR, I think, would like to see greater use of citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies within the democratic policy-making process. It's not an easy answer just to say we want them. We need to institutionalize them in ways they are useful to the policy-making process. I think that's a big question to be thought about. It's a question that we're thinking about. It's a question that Democracy Network and Callum at the front is here thinking about. We don't have quite the answers to that yet, but that's certainly an important thing to think about.
Yeah, and I think the main thing on that is, I think all the evidence shows that where they don't have real power, where it's advisory, is very dangerous. When the decisions that are put through that assembly are taken, I think there's a lot more evidence that it's effective. I'm going to take another round of questions. Gentleman in the front, there's a microphone coming for you.
Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy. A question for Oliver around citizens' assemblies, a follow-up. We support citizens' assemblies. Did you get much pushback in terms of the cost? And if so, how did you deal with that? And what are you going to do longer term about ensuring not just that the 100 people who are on it, but the population as a whole feels as though they are engaged in that process?
Great, and I'll take another couple of questions. The lady just here.
You were talking before about kind of disenfranchisement of voters, and what sort of role do you think the electoral system plays in that? I personally think first past the post causes quite a lot of apathy, so is that kind of something you think reforming that could kind of address the disengagement we've got with people?
Thank you. Shame we don't have Florence here for that one. Gentleman in the back, far corner.
I have a project people might be interested in where I got I recruited 12 random strangers to decide what should happen to some money I inherited. It's called wealthshared.co.uk. Find out more information. My question for the panel is, what is the kind of culture we should be trying to cultivate in the spaces where decisions are made?
Great. I'm sure if you want some more people to help with that, you'll find some willing participants. I'm going to come to you first, Oliver, particularly the citizens' question, but any others you want to come in as well.
Okay, thank you. The short answer is no, but I think largely because the Citizens' Assembly hasn't really kind of taken hold in the public imagination quite yet. We've got 3 Tory MPs in South Yorkshire, and I think it's probably fair to say the Tory MPs try and sort of undermine it, but interestingly, they didn't really go at it from the angle of cost. It was more about the fact that I was somehow some sort of lefty, environmental, net zero obsessed mayor. That was the angle they took when trying to criticise me. Whether or not along the way they suddenly try and find different angles of attack, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm more than happy to defend the amount of money we're spending on that, because my argument has always been that old thing of if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And it is certainly more difficult to go through this process. It's more expensive to go through this process. But I firmly believe that by going through this process, we will end up with a better set of decisions and a better process than if we don't. And I'm very happy when we are potentially looking to spend hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds on transition to net zero, on all sorts of things that will touch on people's lives, that I am able to point at a group of people and say they helped us make that decision. I think you're absolutely right that if it just is that 100 people and no other form of democratic engagement happens outside of it or on top of it, then we'll have failed. It has to be the start of a journey, not the end of a journey. So, as I said before, citizens' juries, other forms of democratic engagement around it and on top of it have to also be part of the programme, and that's what we're looking at the moment. On the question around the electoral system and disenfranchising young people, I mean, look, I've always been slightly on the fence about PR, and I haven't kind of made my mind up, if you know what I mean. I'm open to the argument, and I'm always keen to hear people's perspectives. I'm not sure a PR system necessarily gives you better engagement with young people. I think there are other ways of doing that potentially, but if you've got a view, I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. And then last but not least, just on the culture. A braver culture is my answer, actually. I think there is a hesitancy amongst political leaders, amongst politicians, that is born of the idea that if we listen to people, we might not get the answer we like. And that's ultimately what we're contending with. And I think we have to be braver in asking those questions and braver in hearing the answers. And so it has to be a braver political culture, a culture with more courage politically to actually listen and learn and recognise that not all the right answers are held by a small group of people, be they in Whitehall or in a mayoral combined authority in South Yorkshire. It has to be about listening to the wealth of knowledge, insight, expertise across our communities that is born of lived experience, but we have to be braver to listen to that.
Jessie?
Yeah, I think on the apathy, I mean, at the moment we have a really unequal and unfair voting system. My personal view is that there are places where it feels like your vote doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter what age you are, it feels like your vote doesn't matter. And that needs to be addressed. But also, there are places where you might live in a marginal where your vote really will matter, and your vote will decide who could be the next Prime Minister and who could be the next government, but you still won't feel like your voice and your vote matters. And I remember going into a food bank it was probably last year now actually. I did run a community citizen newspaper, and I was doing a story, and there was a young woman, she was telling a story of this woman who was basically feeding her kids on 4 chicken nuggets. But the sense of those stories were so normal in that place. That was just how life was. And there was very few people, I mean, maybe one, who believed that anything would get better, and most people believed that everything was just going to get worse, because that's what happens, isn't it? It's just crap, and it always gets worse, and we always get the brunt of it, and that's how it is, and that's how it will always be. They're also the places that have the least people that turn out to vote in local elections and national elections. This idea that things will always be the same. So alongside a kind of a bravery, we have to instill hope that things can change, that things can be better, and who you have in government really does matter. And therefore, if it matters, then your vote matters. Because it's people who live in kind of economically disadvantaged are least likely to believe that their vote matters. So we need to change that too.
Thank you. And Parth?
Thanks, yeah. Building on that, sort of the point about the apathy of voters, I mean, this is a real problem, and the age dimension is one of many. Almost any dimension you want to look at, age or education level or income level, whether you own your house or not, what kind of job you do, voter turnout gap has increased across all of those dimensions since the 1960s. There's a forthcoming IPPR report kind of documenting this, and it's quite staggering. There's almost no gap across any of those things I've just said in the 60s. Small gaps in the 70s. Now they are massive. You know, like between young people aged 18 to 24 and above 61, it's about a 30% gap. That is massive, right? The point is, the exact same groups here who don't turn out in lower numbers are the same people who respond saying it's not worth voting when they're asked, right? So there's something going on here. There's some kind of potential doom loop between how much you feel represented in the democratic policy-making process and your participation in that democratic policy-making process. And it's feeding back on each other over the past 2 decades in particular to lead to these sort of wide gaps. So the question is, what do we do about it? And too often, the solution to trying to get more people to turn out focuses on the people themselves, the voters themselves. Oh, let's just educate them a little bit more. That's not the solution. That is one part of it, but we have to look to the other side. What's going on with our politics, our politicians, and our parties? Now, one aspect of that is certainly the electoral institution. There is a relationship in the literature between PR systems and turnout. But is it going to close a 30% gap between old and young people? Absolutely not. That's going to require a much broader set of reforms that looks at party structures and our politicians and how they engage with people at schools, for example, and other parts of civic society. That's probably where I would focus. And I'll comment very quickly on that question about culture. Because if there's one thing that unites people in this country, it's generally a distaste of Westminster, right? So one thing everyone can agree on, everyone hates it. And that relates to this idea that people are broadly fed up of paying for the mistakes of elites. The story of this century is normal people paying for the mistakes of elites, right? That is a really stubborn sentiment that you're not going to budge by just electing a different party to become a government, right? It's going to require us to rewire the democratic machine rather than just redirect it. And again, that kind of brings us back to the point about a more ambitious, coordinated, and clear-eyed program of constitutional reform.
Yeah, I think we also... Got that.
Look out for
It's a very generous audience we've got here today. It's great. We did a session with young people up in Yorkshire, actually, and asking them essentially what would it take to increase voter turnout amongst young people. And we did talk about voter 16 and things like that. It did come up. The thing that came up most was, like, we need a political party that offers us solutions to the problems we're facing. You know, they wanted to talk about climate. That was the thing they wanted to talk about most. So I think, to your point, the parties need to respond as well. I think it's also about having an offer that feels like it's dealing with the problems that people face in their lives at a commensurate scale.
Can I just add a quick anecdote to that? Because the French presidential elections last year are a good example of what happened. Young people in France also don't turn out to vote. They turned out in droves to vote for Marine Le Pen. So these are people who don't vote, and they are young, and they were mobilized by a populist radical because they spent time, weeks and weeks and weeks, with just young people and working out what young people wanted. Then everyone was surprised when Le Pen went into the election saying she was cancelling student debt and she was making a big climate pledge. Why did that happen? Because they spent time talking to young people. What happened? Young people voted for that party.
I'm going to take one more round of questions. So if you put your hands up, the lady at the back just here.
Question for Oliver, and a bit cheeky, I'm afraid, but how much did your Citizens' Assembly cost? And the reason I ask is because I'm from Chichester, and our assembly was derailed, as that gentleman said, because of the grounds of cost. It was going to cost 55,000. I just wonder if you could share that.
65,000.
So the same order. Okay, thank you.
No, sorry, that was a question to you.
55.
Yours was 55.
55, yeah.
Ours was more. Is more.
How much more?
Quite a lot more.
Okay.
I'll tell you after.
Person in the pink top, I think.
To what degree do you feel like the lack of public engagement with party politics, so for example with the election of Truss and then Sunak as party leader and hence Prime Minister, was fairly criticised because it was a relatively small amount of people voting for them? To what degree do you feel like the lack of involvement in party politics fuels like the lack of public engagement with more national politics more generally?
And we'll take a couple more. The lady at the back.
Thank you so much, Emily Jones. I was just going to ask about, it was one thing to, I think, identify in a political platform the things that voters care about. The other is actually being able to deliver. And I'm just thinking in terms of just, if not, you get the populist reaction. So just if Labour comes to power, and it comes to power on the platform of promising to deliver the things that people want, how do you then hardwire the delivery and actually make it responsive? Because I think that's the big challenge. Otherwise, you just create more disillusion, and 4 years later, we're back on a populist wave again.
I'm going to take a couple more just so we get as many as possible. The gentleman just over here.
Hi folks, Gavin McGranahan. I am the Public Affairs Outreach Officer with My Vote, My Voice for a national campaign hoping to mobilise more disabled people to vote in the next general election. And the question to the panel would be, do you think that the Labour Party needs to introduce the concept of accessibility more into these kind of conversations? Because I think most people in this room would agree that our democracy is not a level playing field. And I know certainly for the people that we're campaigning for, there is a dearth of opportunities there for them to get meaningfully involved. I know Florence has spoken about the access to elected office fund, as have other Labour politicians, but there's not really been much clarity from the party as to whether or not it's going to be officially reinstated. I don't know, could be open to correction on that. But I guess just as well as that, you know, in terms of intersectionality, there's a lot of solutions that would help one group get more involved, help another. So I'm just wondering from the panel in general, do you think intersectionality and accessibility need to be brought into more in these conversations?
And finally, I think the gentleman just here had his hand up, so one more question.
Thank you. Richard Swift from Cambridge. I was just wondering what the panel, with the number of people voting going down and down and down, whether it's what the panel thinks about having an Australian-style compulsory voting and bringing in a different type of voting system, for example, single transferable vote. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great. So everything from delivery to intersectionality to compulsory voting. Oliver.
On the accessibility question, I mean, look, we should just make voting easier, full stop, right? I mean, we want people to vote, therefore make voting easier. It doesn't seem like rocket science to me that that should be part of the equation. You know, the idea of ID for being required for voting was a solution looking for a problem, quite honestly, and should never have been introduced in the first place. On voting, I am genuinely interested in the idea of compulsory voting, but I don't think compulsory voting throughout life is necessarily the way forward. I am interested in the question of an age period after 18 or 16 during which young people are supported to vote. I think one of the questions, when we ran the referendum campaign, I don't know if you had this experience, but in Yorkshire, I was on polling day, June 23rd, seared in our memories. I was getting calls from people in Barnsley at polling stations saying that people were turning up saying, how do you do it? Because they actually were turning up for the first time to vote, and that's probably when I knew we were a bit stuffed. But I think that compulsory voting that gives people the opportunity to engage and forces, and you know, we're talking a 20 quid fine. We're not talking, you're not going to jail for 6 months if you don't vote in your local election. But you know, ultimately, I think giving young people that opportunity would be no bad thing. And then, last but not least, just on that point on delivery, like fundamentally important. I was on a call after the HS2 debacle the other day with Rishi. I was on a radio interview on the phone with my local radio station, BBC Radio Sheffield, and the presenter, who I know well, get on well with, we do a monthly phone-in, he said to me, so does this mean you failed then? Essentially, was the question. And
because they cancelled it?
Because they cancelled HS2. It was my fault. They'd cancelled HS2. I hadn't done a good enough job because Rishi had cancelled it. And so delivery is fundamental to all of this, and helping people to understand that we are delivering, really important. What we're here to deliver, really important. But for a Labour government incoming, that focus on delivery in the first 6 months, be it trains or voting reform, is going to be really important, to Jesse's point, to getting people to believe that actually politics can be better and can be different. And so before I came here, I was having coffee with a shadow minister, and I was saying to him that it should be your priority. You know, pick 5 projects and deliver them, because I've spent the last 18 months in this job, and the Labour Party have spent the last 13 years saying they're rubbish, they don't deliver, they're not getting on with the job, they're not making your lives better. I think given where the public mood is, I think if quite quickly we don't turn that around and show people that actually we are here to solve people's problems and make their lives better, that quite quickly people are going to say, well, you're just the same. So I think it's a really important point, and thank you for raising it.
I think if Andy Street couldn't get it stopped, then
well,
you might be forgiven.
I didn't want to say that, but you know, ultimately, I don't think it was solely my fault that HS2 was cancelled. That was my response.
Jessie.
Yeah, so I think on the representation, I mean, we just have to look at members of Parliament, the House of Lords, and do we truly think that that place is representative of the UK population? We know that it isn't. You know, we have probably more landowning lords helping govern our nation than we do landlords. And I think landlords know a lot, pub landlords, I should say, know a lot more about their local community than a landowning lord. So we have a massive issue with representation. And I, like Ollie, I ran for a selection for a mayoral role, which is why we have a little chuckle about Tees Valley. But one of the things that you find when you go through the process is the cost of it and the accessibility to just run, to go and knock on people's doors and to be able to be available day in, day out. The money that you need to spend on leaflets, that's just to get that party that you're running for to be your candidate. And then you face the unconscious bias, potentially, if you were from a minority or a kind of a background, particularly if you're standing in a place that maybe it hasn't got lots of representation in terms of diversity. So there's so many structural barriers that make it really difficult for us to be represented by the people who genuinely would represent our population. So we really have to do something like this, and I do think that Flow will be a big champion for that, and we'd like to host a kind of round table with a lot of those organisations, Operation Black Vote and yourselves, to look at what those solutions could be, and the Accessibility Fund could be one. And I think just on the voting, I think one thing we can be sure of is this current voting system does not deliver. And so we have to look at all of the options, because if we, in 2028, it is going to be 100 years since we talk about 2018 when women got the vote, but it was actually 2028 when there was a much bigger franchise. It was working class women, it was working class men so that's going to be a pivotal moment in the UK history. And it's interesting, we're in a museum today, and I was thinking when I walked in, what would be the pivotal thing that this next government could make history on from a democracy perspective? And if it's not considered that voting is one of them, given it's 100 years since the vote was made more accessible, then I think that would be a really missed opportunity. So we really have to work with all of our colleagues in all of our sectors to put on pressure to whoever's in government to say you must look at voting reform, and these are the potential options, but do it in this term and do it on 2028.
Path. Thanks. The first question was about parties and democracy. I thought it was a really good question, and maybe one that is underappreciated. In the 60s, 1 in 12 people in this country were a member of a political party. Today, it's less than 1 in 50. That's quite a big problem for a party-based democracy, right? It's not just that people aren't members of parties, but the people who are members are not representative of the country at large. That does have an effect on democracy, right? Over the past 40 years, there has been a withdrawal of political parties of all stripes from civil society. Some of that's not their fault. Churches and unions aren't what they used to be, so the Tory and the Labour Party can't be associated with them in the same way. But some of that is active things within these political parties. Some parties have had a stronger party-based democracy, and the Labour Party is the one in the UK that does have that. Even that has changed. This does have a ripple effect on our democracy and how people participate in our democracy, whether they vote, whether they decide to be an MP, and it tilts policy in one direction. We've got a report about that called Road to Renewal. You could read about it. Hardwiring delivery is a great question, Good politicians find the right policy prescription for today. Great politicians change how policy is made tomorrow. That's a really key question. And that is the exam question we think about here at IPPR. What are those reforms, right? One aspect of that is absolutely devolution. You devolve and decentralize more power, you will hardwire delivery. That is something, is almost a mantra worth repeating. But there's more than just devolution. And we've got to think about what else there is. We are working on a report on that. We will come out with what we think hardwires delivery and makes policy more responsive in the long run to all citizens in this country. We're going to try and publish around Christmas, so keep an eye out for that. And we'll be very happy to pick up the conversation there. And I will add just quick comments on the other two questions. Access to political opportunities. I think the one thing I would add is not just sort of voting is one form of political participation, but there are other forms, right? Whether it's joining a political party, whether it's deciding to be an MP or not. That's another thing that Harry and I have written a report about. Why is it that some people decide to run and other people don't, right? We have huge representation gaps in terms of who decides to become a MP, particularly in terms of who's gone to university or who's come from working class backgrounds. Those are the really two big divides. We're doing better on bridging the gender and the race divides, even though they still exist. And that's a question worth asking. One of the things we recommend in that report was a right to run. You have legal duty to take time off work that is paid back when you have to serve to be on jury duty, right? We're saying, well, why don't we do that for people who want to run to be a politician? That's quite a good idea, potentially. So that's something that's worth exploring. I can't remember what the last question was. Compulsory voting, was that it? Yeah, compulsory voting is interesting. And there's a real trade-off here, right? If you look at the evidence, compulsory voting increases turnout and it reduces inequalities. Those are both things we want, and therefore that will have an effect on policy choices. If there are less inequalities in who votes, policy will be more responsive to who votes. But on the other side, there is a very fair liberal argument about compelling people to do something. So that ultimately is a question of, it's a moral question. There is no right or wrong here. It's something we should debate. It's not a conversation we have in this country yet. Whether or not we should do compulsory voting, the answer to that can only be decided by people in this country.
Can I ask a question about that? Because I'm interested in that. But even when you have the opportunity to spoil your ballot and say none of the above, I'm not compelling anybody to make a choice to vote for me or somebody else. I'm saying you can tell me that the system is flawed.
Yeah.
Is that not a part of the process in itself, or is that how is that shown up in the research?
No, I mean, that's certainly still a form of political expression. I don't know how that shows up in the research, and I clearly haven't made my mind up on where I sit on compulsory voting. And like I said, I don't know. Harry might disagree with me, and we'll have to have the debate, at least in IPPR, to start with, before we get out to it. But in general, the evidence does show those countries that have pursued compulsory voting, there is a higher sense of democratic engagement and also greater trust in political institutions. That's also, for example, in other countries where you're forced to work in poll stations, you have a similar effect. So there's something there, and I would at least like to see a lot more discussion about ideas like that.
I think you're definitely on something about younger voters, because I think voting is partly also a habit, and it's a habit that generations are losing. And so there's something about creating a culture of voting that I think we could try and shift over time.
I think if there was compulsory voting for people in the first 10 years of their voting life, obviously not the first 10 years of their life.
There is a political scientist who advocates.
Okay.
Four, is it? Runciman? Yeah.
Okay, I think he, and it's probably a he, is a bit of a donut, but anyway. I think it shifts the policy debate entirely. If you have a cohort of people who are forced to vote in the first from 18 to 28, for argument's sake, and it's just arbitrary, I'm very interested in what that does to the political conversation in this country, because at the moment, in my experience, and certainly kind of talking to people in South Yorkshire, young people have been absolutely shafted by the political system for all too long, certainly over the last few years, and I think we could change the way in which that operates if we were to change the political culture around voting, and compulsory voting might be a way to do that. It's a question.
Oliver, I'm going to end with a question for you that I've been texted from our director of IPR North, who was here and has had to dive off.
And then she ran off.
And then she ran off. Exactly. Which is essentially around devolution. And I guess the question is, what are you hoping for from a Labour government in terms of devolution? And thinking not just about what powers are kind of passed down formally, but the way in which Whitehall and Westminster works to enable that. Because it's all well and good passing down skills budgets or whatever, but if Whitehall still meddles, as you referenced earlier, we still have the same basic setup, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference.
Indeed. Okay. So I was interested in the comment earlier about the Brown review. So this is anecdotal. I don't know if this is true, but I heard a rumour that basically Gordon Brown sent the Brown review into Cabinet for a first kind of look, and they came back to him and said it was too detailed, there was too much in there, it was too big, and when he sent it back, it was 15 pages longer, was what I heard. So there's no shortage, I think, of ideas
there might have been a few more back and forths as well.
So look, I think there's no shortage of ideas for us to kind of like look at, and in terms of specific policy areas, things like health. For me, there was a recent Lancet report which said that devolution had improved health outcomes in Manchester. I think that's something we should look at. I'm interested in health outcomes in South Yorkshire specifically. I'm the only mayor to be chair of the Integrated Care Partnership, so that's a specific area. I certainly think in terms of fiscal devolution, we need to have that conversation about what we're able to do locally and regionally, but it has to be fair. And more broadly, the overarching answer to that question is what I want is a respectful conversation, a conversation that understands that the starting point should not be necessarily the status quo. So the starting point should be an understanding, a belief that communities know their needs best. Mayors are able, I think, to drive policy in a way that could never happen at a national level, because I look people in the eye when I make the decisions that I make. I know the people that I am making decisions for, often by name, and therefore I think government recognising, Whitehall recognising, that actually we are making decisions from a different vantage point, but we have a legitimacy which frankly they sometimes lack. Starting from that point, I think just changes the conversation entirely. So that's ultimately what I would like, first and foremost. And that's why, in answer to the question about where I think the party is at the moment, it genuinely feels to me like there is a shift in the way that the party is engaging with mayors and devolution, and I am all for that because it is moving in the direction that I've just described. And whilst it might not be up on a poster or it might not be on a leaflet or necessarily on the conference stage, I do think that there is a drive towards that within the Labour Party, and I'm grateful for seeing it.
We all know, however, that parties are in favour of devolution and often electoral reform in opposition, and then they get their hands on it. So we have to hold them to account.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's been a great debate, and it's been great to have such an active and lively audience. Do come to other IPR events in the coming days, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.